Welcome into episode 197. Be sure you're following us on Twitter at BaileyJAdams22, at Simmons, at Night Sports Now, and at Pegasus Podcast. Christian, how are you doing as we record this on the eve of your birthday? Birthday music.
Oh, right.
Insert.
Okay. It's funny, you warned me earlier today. You texted me and said, "Do you want me to bring up your birthday on the podcast?"
You said
or
you were
not?"
indifferent. And
I
so as
said,
soon
"I'm
as you said you were
wholly
indifferent,
indifferent."
I was like, I'm
Never
doing
thought
it.
about it again for 1 second until right now. Yes, I am turning a year older than I currently am tomorrow. Well, I guess technically I'm turning a day older than I currently am tomorrow, but
Yeah.
we're gonna mark it as a year. So part of the reason I said I'm wholly indifferent is because I realized when you mentioned this that I did not call out your birthday on the podcast the week of your birthday about 3 weeks ago. So this feels a
Yeah.
little unfair. But
Yeah,
what can
it's
you do?
fine. Who
Yeah, it's
cares?
crazy.
Yeah, are you excited for people to ask you, like, do you feel any different? Does anyone ever ask you that on your birthday? Because I feel like I get that all the time.
Do I feel
And I'm like,
different? I feel
yeah, people
closer
are
to
like, oh,
death
you
than I
feel a
was
year
before.
older? I'm like, no, I don't feel anything.
So it's
Well,
actually
not
funny.
that's not in the dark, but
I
I don't feel anything.
right after I say I'm closer to death than I was a year before.
Yeah,
What's interesting is that I will be, I guess for everyone listening to this, at the time you're listening, I will be 27 years old. I was 23 when we started this podcast.
that is,
It's weird, right?
yeah, that's
Yeah,
very weird. It's a very strange reality that we live in now.
I
Have
know.
we really we've been doing this for that long? Wow.
Yeah. It's now
We're
I was
coming
about
up
to
on
make some
episode
comment
200,
about
so
I was gonna make some comment about how old I feel, but I feel like some of our older listeners would not appreciate a 27-year-old lamenting how they
people
feel
hate when
old
I do that. Yeah.
now.
Sometimes I do it on purpose around people that are older than I am just to see what their reaction is.
It's
Like, oh,
always
just you
bad.
wait. And it's never good.
The thing
But
is, I never cared about, like, as I got older, which I guess isn't surprising. Like when you're a kid and you're in college, whatever, it was something about turning 25. I was fine. I never had a reaction. Turned 25 and was like, oh, I'm just aging now. I guess because you're just out of milestones. Like when you turn 21,
I
it's like, oh, you can drink or whatever. There's just nothing left at a certain
I didn't
point.
feel that. I didn't feel that until I just turned 26. 25 was like, all right, 25 just feels like a round, like, I don't know. It just
Quarter of a
feels like a
century.
number.
Yeah,
Yeah. And then there's 26. I'm just like, okay, now what? Like now I'm getting really not getting that close, but it's like now I'm like barreling toward 30 years old. So it
it's crazy. It's
feels
crazy. I like
bizarre.
how I
But no
said I
one,
wasn't going to do that. And then we immediately did it where we're like, man, I can't believe that we're almost 30.
yeah.
Wild.
No one really cares about this, do they? But but what people do, well, actually, no, people maybe don't care about is UCF football. That's what we're here to talk about. Is I should really explain that a lot better. Um, our topic today is what does UCF have to do to garner more national respect in 2024? And I feel like we should lay the groundwork for where this idea came from, more so than just like they don't get any respect. They deserve respect. It's more so came from the idea that back in 2017, 2018, when they were on their winning streak and coming even after the 2018 season, it was UCF's the class of the group of five. They're the tops, like they're really good. And there was constant part of it was like UCF became the villain because they were disruptors and all that stuff.
Yep.
And then 2019 top 25 season, but Cincinnati kind of started to take that mantle over 2019, 2020, 2021. UCF was still up there, but they started to be talked about a little bit less. And then we had a couple of seasons where it was just, yeah, UCF. And then they get into the Big 12 and they finish 6-6. And like the narrative around UCF is like, oh, they did pretty well for themselves winning 6 games in the first year in the Big 12, which like agree. They were the best of the new four teams, but it's like, it feels like the way the national media and just the national like college football world views UCF is a lot different than it was even 5 years ago.
I'd say even
And
2 years ago, to be totally
yeah,
honest with you.
yeah. And
Um,
so it's a strange thing. And then there's still like a large section of the national landscape that views UCF a certain way because they just hate our fan base. That's valid.
which
But
sometimes I hate our fan base, so
oh,
valid.
all the time. Yeah. But yeah, it's just one of those things where it's like I didn't really realize it until you and I just started talking about this one day, and it was like,
So how it
seems
came up
strange.
initially was that I was, as I've probably mentioned on this podcast many times, I was listening to another podcast. I consume a lot of college football content, perhaps too much, some might say. Maybe even therapists might say it. Not saying any have, just saying some people might say it. And I was listening to Until Saturday, which is the Athletics college football podcast feed, and they were doing an episode that I was excited to listen to because they were going to talk about all of the Florida programs in this episode. So I foolishly, in hindsight, thought, wow, I'll get some real UCF talk from this national podcast. Didn't get it so much. They did 10 to 15 minutes each on Florida, Florida State, and Miami. And then they did a joint topic on UCF and USF, which enraged me because, that's how I am. And I felt that was unfair since one is a Power 4 team and one is not. I also recognize that 2017 me would hate myself for even saying that sentence. But anyway, and their topic for UCF and USF was this. They said, yeah, UCF, they're recruiting pretty well, but they're probably a few years away from being anything in the Big 12. Let's talk about USF and if they can go to the playoff this year with the G5 bid, and then talked about USF for 10 minutes. And I texted you about it because for two reasons. One, I was upset, and it was sort of hitting me in the face of I'd taken for granted that 2017 and 2018 had bought UCF a lot of goodwill from a national perspective where A, they tended to just sort of be a part of conversations even when they couldn't really back it up anymore. And B, they got a lot of benefit of the doubt. They were the G5 favorite every year for like 3 years past when they actually were good. They were the favorite in 2019, 2020, and a lot of people were, it's Cincinnati and then we're kind of split for it in 2021.
Yeah.
And I realized from that, oh, the goodwill's finally gone. it's just not there anymore. And B, and I texted you about this at the time and it made me upset. There wasn't really like, I wanted to message the people who do this podcast on Twitter and tell them why I was upset about this. And I realized I didn't really have any leg to stand on to do so, because what am I supposed to say? Like, well, yeah, they went 6 and 7, but look at their recruiting class. That's what Miami does every year. And it's what we slander them for. And it was just kind of a realization of A, UCF can't really back it up, and B, they've kind of fallen out of the national spotlight, and they've kind of, it feels like the goodwill for 2017-18 is kind of finally fully gone.
It feels like they're, and this is really like weird and sad to say, and it's especially weird just because like of how often we talk about UCF every week, you and I.
Yep.
But it's just like they have just feel like another program now.
Yeah. They're
Like,
kind of back in that boat.
And part of that was, yeah, like there was going to be an adjustment period of like jumping up to the Big 12 and all of that. And it will take time for them to, like, they're going to have to do something. And that's what we're kind of, this conversation is about, is like, they're going to have to do something to get back on everyone's radar. Because everyone, like, as it is right now, everyone's like, oh, yeah, like, I feel like UCF's 2017, 2018 is more of a trivia question now than like what the actual feel is or what the actual like view is of UCF as a program.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's funny if you want to kind of chart it, right? So UCF, obviously, it's kind of funny in hindsight. The Fiesta Bowl win in 2013 didn't really change the program, which it was a huge win. I'm not trying to downplay that season because it was one of my favorite seasons and obviously a huge accomplishment. Not something a lot of G5s have done, period. Win a bowl, let alone win a BCS Bowl, let alone go to one. But it wasn't like 2014, oh, things are different now. UCF's this big brand. I don't know if it was just because that whole team was graduating or whatever. It just didn't really have that vibe. I think anyone who was around for it knows that 2017 changed UCF overnight. I mean, that season they were becoming a bigger deal, and then they won that bowl game, and the noise they made in the offseason. I mean, UCF was one of the conversations of the offseason. That debate raged and raged. And then they backed it up in 2018. And so obviously those 2 years UCF was, particularly in 2018, just kind of, it felt like they were sort of top of the college football world. I mean, I remember that I could go on Twitter every day and there'd be an article or something from one of the Athletic or ESPN or Sports Illustrated, something UCF related. And when you chart it, then they go into 2019, was sort of a, not really a reloading year. If they had a different quarterback situation, it probably would have been a different year, but they still go 10-3. They're still really good, but they fall off a little bit. That was the year where it transitioned to, there were national headlines when UCF would lose that year. There were national stories over Pitt beating them. There were national stories over Cincinnati beating them, which was kind of a weird next step in that evolution.
Yeah, it was weird because it's funny that you say that, because I was thinking about that earlier as I was just preparing for this. It was like, for 2 years, UCF just beat everybody, and that became the story. And then it became like people, whether you hated or loved UCF, you started to watch them hoping, a lot of people hoped that they would lose. On a week in, week out basis. People were watching them and saying like, all right, is this the week they finally lose that winning streak? And
the TV ratings reflected that. In 2018, they were averaging 1.3 million viewers per game. In 2019, it was 1.1 million. For reference, this past season in the Big 12, it was 677,000. But then you go into 2020, and 2020 was still a year where they maintained that. Even with COVID, they went into the year, they were picked to win the AAC. Most people expected them to be the New Year's Six team. They got as high as 11th in the AP poll in 2020 at one point. Then obviously they weren't very good. It's so funny that it coincides with Gus starting here, which is going to feed some narratives probably incorrectly. But 2021 was the first year where it felt really gone because UCF got hit with injuries early, lost early, and just was never anything outside of the city of Orlando that season. And then 2022 was a year where they kept having chances to reclaim it and get the spotlight back and just never did. Everyone knows they're going to host game day if they beat East Carolina. They don't. Everyone knows that they're going to the Cotton Bowl as long as they can, or everyone knows that they're going to host the AAC title game as long as they beat Navy. They don't. Everyone knows they're still going to the Cotton Bowl if they beat Tulane. They don't. And it just, that switch flipped, and it's felt like this year it's just been gone since then.
Yeah, and I don't understand the weird thing about that is I don't remember how it was in 2021. I don't really remember exactly like going into the year. I know obviously like they had the coaching change and they had not a great year in 2020, but Gus had obviously Gus had come in, and I don't really remember what the actual national narrative was like going into that season. Because like
For which season?
I
Sorry.
for
By
2021.
the way, let me just say straight up for the YouTube viewers, I have no idea why Bailey's image is frozen for me. But we can hear him, so that's cool. Maybe this will stop at some point.
Yeah, maybe it will. I don't know.
That's am I frozen for you, or can you see me?
No, you're not. I can see my frozen face, and I have a spinning wheel on my mouse, so I
Okay,
really
let's
don't know
do,
what's going
and
on
we'll
here.
we'll do this live for the podcast. Let's do, and this is great. This is coming off a week where I also want to apologize for our YouTube viewers for not posting an episode on YouTube last week. We had some technical difficulties, and now they're back. That's exciting. Go ahead and turn your camera off and turn it back on.
See, that's the problem. I don't think I can. Zoom is saying it's not responding, but
Okay.
some I don't know how this conversation's continued.
I will we'll just do the rest of this podcast with me here talking and you be unfortunately frozen on a moment where you look really mad at me about something, but it's fine. We'll just keep it rolling.
Yeah, I guess so. But no, so going back to what I was saying, it's 2021. It I don't remember what the thing was, the whole narrative was going into that season. Just I remember it being like, oh, Gus Malzahn is the new head coach. And then because of the injuries early on, because of the early loss, like, yeah, it did kind of just disappear. I don't know that it was ever really back to what it was pre 2020 or even beginning of 2020. But it has kind of steadily just decreased year over year. And I guess the weird thing is with the Big 12 move, like there was a lot of like, oh, UCF going to the Big 12. That's awesome. And then the Big 12 season happened, and then it's just kind of like, oh, yeah, like the newness of being in the Big 12 has worn off. So it's like, yeah, they're
Yeah.
just, again, like I just said, like feels like they're just another program.
Well, first off, let me say for 2021, that was Cincinnati had just gone to the Peach Bowl and narrowly lost to Georgia in 2020 and was returning everybody. So they had taken the G5 Darling title, but UCF was still at that, at that brand level. I'm looking at the AAC preseason poll for 2021. UCF was picked to finish second in the AAC, and they were the only team other than Cincinnati to get first place vote. So they were still in that mix. And then, like I said, the injuries hit, and it was really felt from that point on it because they completely fell out that season, then just couldn't get back in 2022 despite having opportunities. Like the Louisville Friday night game, it was just they fell flat enough that you couple that with this season being what it was always going to be. I'm not saying that 2023 was a disappointment, but they didn't really do anything to differentiate themselves from other teams at their level, and that was just kind of it. And I feel like you're really feeling that for 2024, and it's part of why I'm so interested in how the season's going to go, because 2024 is a season that on paper, if all things were the same and this was 2 years ago, I think UCF's getting a lot of hype right now. They have the most well-known quarterback they've had since Dylan Gabriel and KJ Jefferson. They return a lot of key players. Everyone thinks, as far as people around the program, people covering the program, that they have the potential to be very, very good this year. This feels like the classic offseason where there should be like, oh, UCF, they're threatening for a playoff spot, or oh, they could be really good. And just no one's really talking about them. And that's a weird adjustment.
Yeah, and we did talk a little bit last week about KJ and how popular like he is, I think, and that's
Yeah.
the one like little bit that we're getting right now nationally is like there is some talk about KJ Jefferson, but it is kind of strange. And like we've seen, I think the Big 12 championship odds, like UCF's like sixth, which like in year two, I think is pretty cool and pretty good. But overall, like you still think about it in this in the scope of the whole conference, like six is kind of like they're there, like they're
Yeah.
in the mix, but they're not really a contender. So it's like, what do they have to do? Like, I don't know if it's going to be an overnight thing. Like, obviously, it's an overnight thing. The easiest thing to do is just keep winning. Or not, that's easy, but like the quickest way to get that back is just to start winning a lot and really to be in contention probably for the conference title this year. Get some big wins under your belt.
I think that it's going to take a playoff appearance. I think that I don't know if the average fan of college football is ready for how in the 12-team playoff era and what is widely assumed to become the 14 playoff era in 2 years, how much seasons are not going to matter that don't end in a playoff appearance. The fact that that was already happening to a degree with a 14 playoff and now we're going to 12 and then 14, it's like, I just think that for most fan bases, and I don't know how healthy this is, but it's going to be true, everything outside of a playoff appearance just isn't going to matter. And it's funny how for UCF, I do think that we owe Danny White and everyone who was in the administration and content, everything at that time, a big debt for really pushing UCF as more than, just a team that won games in that 2017 to 2018 stretch. Because I'll tell you something else. UCF hasn't been at that level since 2018. And we're talking about how it took until really 2023 for the effects of that to fully wear off. Cincinnati was entirely out of the spotlight and playing all their games on ESPN Plus and all that a year after making the playoff. Think about the difference there.
Yeah, that is.
Your camera's back.
I know that was a weird thing that I've been staring at my own frozen face for so long, and my Zoom saying not responding. I'm like, how is the call still landing? And then it just, I don't know, it did something weird.
We're
And
just
now
happy
my
about
face and I'm moving again. It is weird that you said that. It's actually a really good comparison to Cincinnati because like this past year, yeah, they were in the same spot as UCF as far as like new conference, Big 12, all that. They were at the bottom of the conference, and there wasn't even like an inkling of anything relevant. And I'm not even saying that to be like to dunk on them or anything. It's just like it's unique the spot that now UCF and Cincinnati, who were just a few years ago like a really hot topic in college football, are now just kind of like, yeah, they're also here.
Yeah,
And
it's just funny to me that the Cincinnati decline was a lot faster. And even you compare it to this season, I know that everyone complained about, and I want to make this point. I know a lot of people complained about how UCF was on FS1 all the time. And
yeah,
I was one of those people. So I'm not here to be like, you were wrong or whatever. But it was interesting how part of the reason that UCF was on FS1 so much is that they'd proven themselves that they had enough fans and were interesting enough of a name against other teams to produce a solid broadcast number. Like all of UCF's FS1 numbers were pretty solid, that they knew they could get into that 300,000 to 500,000 range for most of those games, and that was valuable to FS1 to know they had a team they could stick there and get those ratings, because that's not a guarantee when FS1 puts Mountain West games or even some other Big 12 teams. It's not like that. It's why Cincinnati played 4 games on ESPN Plus this year. It's why Baylor played 7 games on ESPN Plus this year. ESPN Plus is where they just pump the teams they don't see any reason to any value in broadcasting. UCF only played 1 ESPN Plus game. That was actually literally, other than Texas, that was tied for the least in the conference. The only teams who only had the 1 minimum ESPN Plus game were UCF, BYU, Kansas, and Oklahoma. Everyone else had multiple ESPN Plus games. So like the fan base is there and the interest is there. They're still far ahead of the other new 4 that have joined. It's just we need some kind of jump start this year to kind of get that mojo back, because I don't know how far we get into the future before UCF being good isn't interesting. I think if UCF was good last year, it would be interesting because of the brand they still have. That fades a little more every year.
and it's really actually like this conversation has gone even more different than I thought it would, just because I'm thinking of the different degrees of relevance, the different degrees of national attention. Because like there is flash in the pan, like for a week. Like when they beat Oklahoma State, there was a little bit of like, oh wow,
Yeah.
they just beat number 15 Oklahoma State at home by 42 points.
But
Like,
interesting, and this was another point where I noticed it, and I didn't say it on the podcast at the time. I don't remember if it wasn't really a thought I had until the offseason or whatever, but it makes you a little queasy because those were getting headlines, and it was all about Oklahoma State failing. It wasn't about
yeah,
UCF, which I get it's the season they're having, but that was still a departure for it to just more be like the headline is Oklahoma State lost, not that UCF
right.
won a game.
Where it's like, oh wow, that's embarrassing. They lost to UCF
Yes.
like that.
Yep.
Where it's like UCF was beating teams like that. I know it was in years ago at this point, but UCF was beating teams like that every week, and it was like, wow, look how dominant UCF is. Yes,
Yeah.
that's a good point. It is a good point, and I wonder, like, that's where I look at this year and look at 2024. I think obviously, like you said, playoff appearance. I wasn't even really thinking that high. I was thinking like, yeah, I get it. Just depends, I guess, on the degree, because I'm thinking of it. And my true answer was they need to be in contention for the like conference championship game by like late into the season, like into November,
Yeah.
to be like in the mix where they're getting talked about when it's like, oh, who's going to win the Big 12? If that question is being asked at the beginning of November and UCF is a potential answer, even if it's like kind of still an outside shot, like that'll at least be a little bit different.
Yeah.
And
remember that the Big 12 conference champion is now guaranteed a spot in the playoff starting this
yeah,
season. So if UCF, that's why it will be an even bigger conversation than it would have been this year. Like if UCF, you get to November, and like you said, they're one of 4 teams. It's not going to be 4. It's going to be more because this conference is ridiculous. But say they're one of 5 or 6 teams that are still in real contention for that spot. That's a lot of attention nationally. And honestly, because of the way that, and this is what's great about UCF's admin and their content folks and everything, is UCF's just a lot better at capitalizing on that attention than some other schools are. I you know me, and I don't like Cincinnati, but I was going after them on this podcast in 2021 because they just weren't doing anything with the attention they were getting. And if UCF's in the mix, they'll get their headlines. They'll find ways to make themselves known and keep that brand building going. But you're right, it's even if they miss the playoff, which like I think is the most likely outcome. I'm definitely not ready to say that they're a playoff team this year. If you're just in that mix and in that contention, you're a name people are talking about, we're still close enough to that 2017 to 2018 and 19 stretch that people are going to perk up a little more at that name than like, I don't know, if like some other random Big 12 team is in the mix, like if Texas Tech is in the mix or something like that.
Right. And I think like going back to what I said, like last year they beat Oklahoma State and it was like a 1 week thing. Like there are chances for that this year. Like they play Florida, obviously. That's going to be a game that draws a
That
lot of
one's going to
attention.
get, that's
They
a
beat
huge
Florida.
opportunity. Yeah.
If they beat Florida, they're being talked about a ton because wow, UCF just beat Florida in the swamp. Same thing, I think, even with Colorado. I know like the shine kind of came off Colorado toward the end of last year, but like it will be back as the season gets closer this year, and there'll be a lot of talk about Colorado and Coach Prime and all that. If UCF beats Coach Prime in Colorado, again, that's just a name, and that is a
You're
program
right.
that is getting headlines now. So it's like that will be in the mix.
And I got to tell
Obviously,
you, before we get too
yeah.
far away from it, that Florida game is that one is a huge opportunity because as we've been talking about and everything, it's like that game there will be so much that week after. It's going to be all about Billy Napier's future, and he might even get fired after that. There, you're going to see all these articles and podcasts that week of what's the hierarchy in the state of Florida now. Like that is a huge opportunity. And you're right about Dion too, because people are obsessed with Dion. Even if he loses 9 games, if one of the 9 he loses is to UCF, it'll be a headline that week.
And I'm trying to think if like the last few years, what was UCF's like peak peak time in the national spotlight, like after say post 2020? Was it the Florida win in the Gasparilla
Yeah,
Bowl?
because that was a big deal, and I know that it wasn't like it wasn't as big of a deal outside of Orlando as it was to UCF fans here, obviously. But you got a lot of those types of articles about, oh wow, UCF this and that, and it
Yeah.
was that there were points in 2022 where they kept getting very close to that. I think when they beat Cincinnati and then beat Tulane, there was a lot of hype around them
Mhm.
as the Cotton Bowl team, and then they lost to Navy, and that went away pretty quick. But they've had moments, but it's never been sustained, sustain anything. And I got to tell you, the whole sustain thing is what's hard because you look at a team, I mean, really making it as a brand is when you're like Miami, right? Where you
Yeah.
can effectively be horrible at football. Not even horrible, but they haven't been good for any prolonged stretch of time for 20 years now. And they are still talked about nonstop because that's having a brand. And I was impressed, really impressed with how they were never at that level, obviously, but how quickly they carved out a brand for themselves and where they just became one of those teams people talked about, given how young they are and given they hadn't won a national championship everyone acknowledges or anything like that. I mean, I want to throw you an example. TCU in the year 2022 came out
Mhm.
of nowhere, made the playoff, won a playoff game, went to the national championship game. Did you think about TCU for 1 second at all last season?
Other than when they played Colorado, no.
They were gone. We're in their conference, and I feel like I did not give them a single thought. I mean, they got no brand boost whatsoever from making the national championship game because it's just different teams capitalize on different ways. They're a very small fan base, and B they didn't do anything the next year. They were bad right away, and it was just I
Yeah.
mean that's how hard it is to
And
build a
here's
brand. Is you can make the national championship game and then be off the national radar entirely 8 months later.
the funny thing about that too is as I was kind of looking at, I have the schedule over here on my wall, and I was like looking at like, all right, what is UCF's opportunities for big wins this year? And I'm going down the list and like Florida, Colorado, like Utah down at the end of the season because Utah's just been
Yep,
that good every year.
they're
And
always
I'm looking
good.
at it, I'm like, what other ones? And I'm like at TCU, I'm like, like who would really care if UCF went to TCU and beat them? Like they went to the playoff 2 years ago. Like,
They didn't go to the playoff.
yeah,
They made the national
exactly.
championship game.
It's crazy. It's crazy to me because it's like you look. I'm like, yeah. Would you really flinch if UCF went on the road? Like I'm almost expecting them to go to TCU and win. Like
I know,
that's
which
the
is narrow mind or short sighted,
yeah.
but that's how I feel too. But you're right. It's kind of how I look at it. Is I look at games on their schedule, and it's hard to know in the offseason because you never know. It turns out Iowa State's 12-0 or something. Who knows? But
Right.
I always look at it
It
as
is March 20th.
which of these games is there a chance they'll actually talk about on game day? Not pick, but like will just come up over the 3 hour course of game day, and that's kind of how you pick it. TCU is not one of those games.
Mm-mm.
Colorado is. Florida is. Utah might be, depending on how things are going. I mean, but that's what UCF has
Even
to sort of build back towards.
even outside of those, like I don't know if there are any. It will depend on how the seasons are going for everyone else. But like as of right now, as far as big brands talked about a lot, it is those three. And it'll depend on, and we talked about this. I can't remember. Obviously, it wasn't this past season going into the first year in the Big 12, but it was maybe 2022 where we talked about like for UCF, they needed to be in the conference, like in the running for the conference, like late enough into the season, like because we hadn't seen it for a few years. They dropped that game early in 2020 to Tulsa. The Cincinnati game in 2019 was pretty early, wasn't it? And
Yeah,
then
that was like the fourth or fifth game of the season.
2021 they lost They lost a couple early losses. The Navy one was early, so it was like they started out conference play with a loss. It's like obviously that was probably going to always happen in 2023. So, and then again, obviously 2022 they played for not the national championship, the
Conference
conference
title.
championship.
Does that just feel like a thing that didn't happen? Like sometimes I have
It
to remind
does.
myself they played for a conference title that year.
It does. The Nate, and it's because I don't know what, really is if the real reason why, but to me, it's because of the Navy game.
It
Like
felt
the
like the
Navy
season
game,
was done after that.
it felt like after they lost to Navy, that cost them the conference championship
Yeah.
appearance.
Yeah.
And I just don't
But they
like,
were in a, like, I remember sitting in a hotel room in Louisiana 2 or 3 hours before that game, researching stats about G5 teams in New Year's Six Bowls. So I'd have it ready to tweet in case they made the Cotton Bowl. And now it's like in hindsight, that's hours before their final game of the regular season. I guess not regular season, but you know what I mean? Final game before
yeah.
bowl. And now it's like in hindsight, I look at that season and I'm just like, that was a nothing season. Like it just, and I feel like most of the fan base, all of the fan base probably kind of agrees.
Was it? And I'm looking, this is kind of taking us off the rails a little bit, but like looking at that game, I remember going into that game thinking they weren't going to win. Was it because JRP was so banged up? Was that the reason why?
You know, it's funny because I remember going, I thought they were going to win. I think I did. I
For
have to
some
go listen
reason.
back to our
Yeah, I
podcast,
don't
but
know.
I felt that they were going to win. We knew JRP was banged up, but I don't know. Maybe I didn't. I don't remember.
I can't remember. That's what I'm saying. Like in my mind right now, I'm thinking, oh, I thought like for some reason they were going to lose that game, but maybe it's just because.
Part of it is just that they'd beaten Tulane earlier in that season, and it's very very hard to beat a team twice in the same season. But I didn't buy that their home atmosphere was going to be good. I went to the game; it was good. It was sold out and
Yeah,
very loud, and I just felt that. And I can tell you how I felt about this because we went on this whole take after that Tulane game that they were just going to they just out talented Tulane. That while Tulane was obviously very good and playing above their talent, Florida speed is just different, and that wasn't a team that could hang. And I think we just latched onto that and just kind
probably.
of ignored the facts that A, Tulane was really good. They had a good quarterback. It's hard to beat a good team twice. B, UCF, like half their defense was playing to hop in the portal after that season. I don't know how locked in they were to that game. And also John Russ Plumlee was hurt. So it just, yeah,
Yeah.
that was a whole thing.
So anyway, getting back to what we were previously talking about, like 2024, getting back to the national spotlight, like 8-4 doesn't really do it. Like I don't think. Like they have to have like a really really good like they have to win 9 or 10 games and again be in that conference title and playoff picture late into the season to really matter to everyone again, which is just like that's a tall ask because like yeah, if they win 8 games, like that's a really good step forward, I would say, into year two. I know the thing with UCF, it's weird, and we'll talk probably more about expectations as the offseason goes on, we get closer to the season, but they built up last year, and a lot of this was some of the stuff that Gus was saying, and just in general is like, oh, like we think we can compete right away. And obviously that wasn't the case, and it should have never really been the case because they did not have that kind of depth and they didn't have linebackers. But going into this year now, like they get Kobe back, they get RJ back, they go out and get a 1 year quarterback guy like KJ Jefferson, where it's like we plan to compete this year. And so they keep setting themselves up for this like 1 year windows. So like if they do win 8 games, like I'll feel like, oh, that's a good step forward. But like also they kind of set this up to like make a run at this in 2024 and they fell short of it.
And
So it's gonna
everything you're
be weird.
saying, I can't echo it enough because you're right that if just in a vacuum you had told me after they accepted the Big 12 invite back in, I guess that would have been 2021, if you had told me
Yeah.
that they would go 6-6, then 8-4, then 10-2, for example, I would say, great. That's the way it's supposed to work. That's the way it typically works. That's great. Remember that even late into last season, we were thinking that this year was going to be even worse because they hadn't
Yeah.
made the moves they made. We weren't sure. The problem is that when you talk the way they do, but talk the way Gus has, when you bring in a final year quarterback who's very, very good in KJ Jefferson, when you bring back seniors who are coming back for one more year, when you revamp your staff, this feels like a chips are all on the table year for Gus Malzahn. He's all in. And yeah, it's crazy that he set himself up where 8-4 is not acceptable in year two in the Big 12, but is it safe to say that that would not be an acceptable result for the season?
In context, yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
That's what's bizarre. Like they really are, and it just feels like it's gonna be an every year thing with him. Like if it's not this year and everything, they run it back next year, they're gonna figure out some way they're gonna figure out how to go into next year thinking we can win the Big 12. And
Yeah, but it's the thing about this conference too is and I keep trying to prepare fans for this, and they might just have to see it and see the other teams. Like how many losses is the Big 12 champion going to have this year? I'm willing to bet it's going to be at least two.
Yeah, two or three probably. I feel like two or three is like almost going to be standard in this
There's
conference.
no bottom to this conference. It's not like the ACC where, yeah, Florida State has to deal with Clemson and they have to deal with, I don't know, Miami, or I'm actually struggling to come up with another good program. Louisville, I don't know. But for all
Sort of.
those, there's also Boston College and Syracuse and Wake Forest and Duke. And I understand UCF lost to Duke 2 years ago, haha. But still, a lot of teams that just typically aren't good and also don't really care about being good. That's the big thing. Boston College doesn't really care if they're good at football. Neither does Duke. Neither do a lot of these teams. It's even the same in the Big Ten. In the Big Ten, for every Ohio State, there's a Northwestern or an Illinois or a Purdue
Indiana.
or whoever, in Indiana, a Rutgers, a Maryland. I mean, come on, half their conferences teams who don't care. And every single team in the Big 12 cares exactly as much, if not more, than UCF does. And all of them are very similar programs. And it just is one of these things where it's always going to be a bloodbath. I mean, UCF can have a great team that, like, in the ACC could go 10-2, but they're in the Big 12, so it might be more like 8-4. And it's just, we're going to have to recontextualize things a little bit. It's really just going to have to be more about how close did you come to win the conference, you know?
Yeah. And this just has me thinking, like, who's going to be the worst team in the Big 12 this year?
I don't
Like,
know.
the lower tier teams, you probably think, like, as of right now, March 20th, we don't know anything on March 20th. Cincinnati and what, Arizona State, maybe?
I think Cincinnati, Baylor, and Arizona State would be your picks for the
Yeah.
bottom three. And honestly, pick any of those three teams, and if we're talking about how they're actually 9-3, it wouldn't be a huge surprise.
That's the
But
thing, is like, as bad as Cincinnati was what did they go in the conference last year? Was it 1-8?
1-8, I think, yeah.
1-8, UCF beat them by 4, I think
I'm
it
just going to
was.
read you the list of teams in the Big 12 who, for the year that is 2024, believe that their mission is to win the Big 12 championship. That list is Arizona, Colorado, which that one's kind of nuts, but some of them do think that. Iowa State to an extent. Kansas really believes it. Kansas State really believes it. Oklahoma State really believes it. Texas Tech believes it. UCF believes it. Utah very believes it, and West Virginia believes it. I just listed a whole conference of teams,
Right.
and all of those fan bases or administrations think their goal this year is to win the Big 12. That's not historically normal. There's never been a Power 4 conference or Power 5 conference, whatever, that's been like that. It's going to be a freaking bloodbath every year.
And I do wonder, tying all of that back into our original question, is it ever going to be possible? Like, I don't know that it's ever going to be possible for UCF to get back to that status they were where they were. And I'm now curious about the comparison of, like, the status of being like the group of five, like the group of five team, like the top dog in the group of five, versus, if they're in the status of, like, yeah, they're a solid program year in and year out. What's the comparison there? I guess now that playoff spot is tied into being the best group of five team, it's like, that would have been nice if that was a thing back in the day.
I think it
But
would work like this. Like, let's just talk about, I know the conference doesn't exist anymore, but if just as a college football fan, if I said who are some Pac-12 teams who come to mind when you're thinking about the Pac-12?
Oregon, USC,
Yeah. So if you're
Washington.
UCF, your goal is when someone asks someone that about the Big 12, you want to be a name they say. Who are some Big 12 schools you think about? Well, I think about UCF, Oklahoma State. I mean, that's the ceiling, honestly, in a conference this deep.
And that's going to take, I think that for that question, that's going to take a few years. And I don't even know. I mean, it does correlate to winning, but I've seen people who, like, sports fans, not know, college football fans, just like casual ones, be like, "Oh, UCF's in the Big 12 now." Like,
Yeah.
when did
Yeah.
that happen? It's like, yeah, this year. So
They
it's
got
like,
to
it's going to be
establish
a few years
themselves.
for people to just know, like, yeah, the conferences look different, and now UCF is in the Big 12. So
I really seriously think, and it's such a high bar, but the only way that, and I have to say another thing is and it's why this is such an interesting topic to me, is that this is a very, very unique to UCF issue. UCF is one of a very, very, very small group of college athletics programs who are not currently a major brand and believe it is their destiny to become one. That's
yeah,
not a big group. Most of the vast majority of college football is either already a major brand or has no belief that they ever will be because they're 150 years old, never happened. UCF's in that very small group of young upstart programs who believe it's their destiny. And that's a tough spot to be in because that's always been the thing with UCF. And it's been like literally from like when my dad was going to UCF in the 80s and they were a D2 program. It was people talked like, we're going to keep climbing and eventually we'll get there. And that's been made worse by the fact that UCF's backed it up every step of the way. And now we're at another point where it's kind of an inflection point where they've got to keep climbing. And I don't know how you build the type of brand UCF wants to have with anything short of making the playoff. And that doesn't mean make it every year. I'm not talking
yeah.
about something insane like that, but you have to make it probably, I don't know, once every in a 14 or 12 team playoff, probably once every 3 to 4 years. And you have to be in contention for it most years. And you have to
And
win games when you get there.
that is why this conversation is so interesting, is like those teams and those programs that maybe don't think like, oh, we're supposed to be a big brand, but their focus is like seasons. Like,
Yeah.
oh, like this is our
Maybe
big
we'll have a
season. Like,
special
yeah,
season. Yeah.
special seasons for, and that is like, it's a mindset that I wouldn't even like. I'm not shying away from the fact that like I feel that way, where it's like that's the way I view UCF. Maybe it's just kind of how I think this fan base feels, and like you said,
Yeah.
it's always felt. So it's like, yeah, I don't know, like I would be fine. Like if it was a thing, one of those things where like UCF has a special season. I don't know, like what's acceptable. Like it's weird because for most programs in that level would be like, yeah, if they had one like once every like 5 or 6 years, like that's great. If UCF goes like with one really really special season every 6 seasons, I think people would be pissed.
It would be bad. People would get fired. It's not, that's not, and it's crazy. Like I said, it's a weird, very small box UCF is in where they don't necessarily have they don't have the brand and don't even necessarily have the history to fully back it up, but their fans demand being a very good team all of the time. And it'll be an adjustment. I think that I'm not saying that, like, I hope people don't come away from this like, oh my God, UCF's doomed. They'll never be what they should be. I think they're set up to have a lot of success in this conference. I don't believe that there's a reality where 5 years from now we're sitting here and UCF has never made the playoff, never played for a Big 12 title. They're just 6-6 every year. I don't think that's on the table, to be honest. And part of it is I know it isn't, because as long as Malzahn sticks around at bare minimum, they're just out recruiting the rest of the Big 12. And you're not going to feel that through one class, but they just put up a class that was significantly better than almost all of the conference. Not just like a little better. They were ranked above this team, significantly better than a lot of the conference. If you're not paying attention to recruiting because it's March, so I don't blame you, they're well on their way to doing the same thing this year. And I don't know how many times I have to say that if they keep doing that, there are going to be a good 6 or 7 teams in the Big 12 that they just have more talent than every year. So they're on their way. They're doing everything right. They're being cutthroat. They're taking leaps to try to make shortcuts and get there faster. It's just, I think this year is really important from a perception from, I don't even know what I'm trying to say. Perspective, perception. There's some keyword that I'm trying to say that fits here.
Okay.
But just from the fact that
perception, I think, from a perception standpoint.
Yeah, from a perception standpoint. I got it right the first time and then said I got that wrong. So that was a great moment for me. But where they've gone all in, they have the star quarterback, they have the great players returning, they have an amped up fan base, they have a schedule that kind of sets up nicely for from a brand building perspective. You got to go do something with it now. We can't be sitting here and talking about an 8-4 season. We just can't. And I'm gonna hold myself accountable to that.
Is that like the way they've approached this of putting the chips in and trying to take a shortcut and be very successful very fast? Could that work against them? Like, I mean, we're kind of talking the way we're talking. It sounds like, yeah, like that is.
We're talking about 8-4 in year 2. Like it's something that can't happen. Yeah, it can work against them.
So it's and that's what's even weirder, because like it almost makes the road even longer if you have a couple seasons where you're like, yeah, we're going to be really, really good this year. And then you're just kind of like, because then people start to be like, well, that's every year. Like they think it's their year and they're fine. Like they're good, but they're not great. And the more and more seasons you stack of those in a row, that's another easy path to becoming just an afterthought. Because it's like if you're a seven win team every year, it's like, oh yeah, it's a pretty good program. But unless you have one of those big years, and when you're setting yourself up to have a big year every year and you can never hit that, then it gets to be like, oh yeah, that's just they're kind of delusional at that point. Like,
yeah,
and that's why this season is so interesting and so massive for like you said, for that perception, because they are putting it all in and they're thinking we're going to go challenge for a conference title, and we'll see if they have the talent for it. We'll see if they're deep enough for it. But the way they're acting and the way they're moving into the season is in preparation to be that. But like you said, the problem is 6 or 7 other teams in the conference feel the exact same way and feel like maybe they're even in a better spot. So,
and that's the scary part.
Someone's going to end up.
It's why I wish that the administration and coaching staff were kind of sending a different message right now, because I just worry about donor fatigue. I worry about fan fatigue, because they are in a situation where they could have this offseason done everything right. They could have hit on all these transfers. KJ may fit perfectly in a Malzahn offense. They could have done everything right and then still go 8-4, because literally it can come down to 3 plays not going your way. I mean, that's how razor thin this conference is. And that's why I'm upset with kind of the boat we're in now and the way that they've talked about the season, because it's out of their hands. They're talking like it's not, but it is out of their hands. It's just that's this conference, and yeah, you need luck. You need a little bit of luck to do what they want to do this season, and I don't like when you preach something as it's absolutely going to happen when it's a thing you need luck to do.
Yeah, and because like we were just saying, but as much as it is to build their like they have those brand building games on the schedule. They go 8-4 and they've beaten Colorado and they've beaten Florida. Like that should feel like a really good, really strong year.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways it is. But when you're setting things up to be like, we're going to play for a conference championship and a playoff spot, then and you fall short of that by 2 or 3 games, then it's like, well, you were not really that close, were you?
And
And
honestly, you made a good point that it's going to depend. Like 8-4 might be viewed differently on how they get there. Like if they get there by beating Colorado and Florida or in Cincinnati, like beat all the teams we hate, it's probably going to feel a little different than if they're 8-4 because
for
they lost those
UCF
4
fans, but
games.
I'm wondering about nationally, like
Yeah.
how big is it nationally if UCF goes 8-4, they beat Florida, but Florida's 5-7, 4-8,
I
because then
think
they're like, yeah.
that I don't know. I think the
Then it
Florida
becomes
one's big
more.
no
I
matter
feel like
what. I think that one is. I think Florida could go 0-12, and that's still huge because UCF is going to hammer that in recruiting nonstop. That
yeah.
we've now beat Florida twice in a row, and B, it's just if Florida loses that game, I'm bookmark this podcast. Get back to me. You're going to get all these great features in the week after about not just the rise of UCF, but the downfall of Florida. How wow, Florida's fallen off. What's
I feel like
happened to
there's
them?
going to be more of that. That's what I'm a little bit actually worried
Yeah,
about. Is I feel like it's going to be mostly just like where has Florida gone wrong, and not like
but
what has
that's
UCF
fine
done.
because UCF still, it may not be in that moment, but UCF still capitalizes that on a brand perspective in the long term. If they start being
Yeah.
viewed, I think the biggest absolute massive hurdle UCF has ahead of them as far as brand in the coming half decade is to start being viewed in the same category as Miami, Florida State, and Florida. Because even though they are in the Power Four now, they are not viewed that way. The Athletic, in all
That
of their
podcast
articles
that
online,
you
not just the podcast, every time they regularly do articles about the state of Florida, it is always there's a blurb specifically for each of the big 3, and then there is a UCF and USF blurb. That is the biggest hurdle they have left, is to get into that group of 4. And beating Florida will do a lot. Maybe people will talk more about Florida's downfall, but it's still just going to almost subconsciously change how people view UCF in relation to those programs because they're just going to feel like part of that club versus this upstart.
and that's what's cool about that stretch in the schedule is they play Colorado and Florida in back-to-back weeks.
Yeah.
Like if they win
Yeah, it's
both
going to
of
be
those
fun.
games, like that.
Who do
Winning
they
those
play
games
after that?
back to
Who's the
back,
next one?
Cincinnati.
Cincinnati.
So you win those 3 games in a row, and all of a sudden, you've built yourself up into this. Because you're going to that Colorado game at worst 2-1.
Yep.
And I would venture to say, like as of right now, March 20th again, 3-0. You win those 2 games or those 3 games, you're 6-0 going into the Iowa State game in the middle of October.
And let me tell you about, even regardless of how the rest of the season goes, if you've got a 6-0 UCF team that's leading the Big 12 and beat Florida, that's going to be a team that's getting talked about. And
yeah,
I also just have to say on a personal note, I think that if they were to beat, it's asking a lot. If they were to beat Colorado and Florida and Cincinnati, I think that might be the happiest 4-week period of my entire life. I'm serious. Yeah. I really think
no, I mean that bye week between TCU and Colorado is going to be so nerve-wracking.
It is and it isn't. It's going to be nerve-wracking. Nah, I'm going to say it's not. I'm going to make a prediction right now that it's not going to be because Colorado will already have played at Nebraska and at Colorado State and Baylor. So like we might know a lot about how bad Colorado is by that point. And also, if UCF beats TCU, I'm just not going to be worried.
You said that though, but I could see them. I could see Colorado winning all 3 of those games.
I think Colorado is going to be really bad this year.
I don't know.
I know this isn't a
much
Colorado
about,
podcast.
I don't know
They
much
signed
about their
6 high school prospects, man. 6. Dion, there's all this stuff actually going on today is about Dion's taking all this heat because it was reported and turned out to be true that he's never visited a high school since becoming their head coach. I think that's a dumpster fire.
So the Dion fatigue is already starting.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know. We'll see. Maybe they'll surprise me. They surprised a lot of people last year, but that doesn't seem to be trending in a positive direction. And a lot of their coaches left. So
just in general, it's a great schedule. No,
it's the best
that's
schedule
not what
ever.
we came in here like talking about, but like it does tie in, and it's a great schedule.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we have these freewheeling topics, we're allowed to just randomly get off topic. I think that's
what's crazy though is like it's so bad that I can see this happening. That yes, they go into that Iowa State game 6-0. They're 6-0 halfway through October. They finish the season like 8-4, 7-5, and we're like they fell apart down the stretch.
I just have this weird vision, and it's not good, but I just keep seeing it in my mind over and over again. And it's UCF literally having like an 8-0 start and then just falling apart in November, because November sucks. You've got Arizona, at
Yeah.
Arizona State, at West Virginia, and Utah. Like
Well, they're
I
not
see
losing
the
to
vision of
Arizona
them.
because it's the space game, so
Well, of course, and they can't lose the
they'll
space
be
game,
9-0
but
if
I keep
that's the
forgetting that's the
case.
space game. That's going to be an
Yeah.
interesting one. But I see the vision of this great, amazing start where we're all having the time of our lives, and then they get to November and just things go off the rails. Not saying they lose all four, but they lose a couple, and that's that, you know?
Yeah. And this is just I can look at the schedule in so many different ways and see all these different scenarios really happening. I can picture a lot of them. And one I just pictured was getting to that Utah game, needing to beat Utah to go to the Big 12 title game and then losing to Utah. Because Utah's very good. It's one of those things
It's
where it's
funny. The
like
one I keep seeing is UCF and Utah play each other, then rematch in the Big 12 title game.
I have a harder time seeing that one, but
It's why this
yeah.
offseason is going to be fun, particularly since it's March and we have a few more weeks of spring ball here and then many months of nothing. Is that, and we're going to be very open about this, even though this is a podcast that we prefer you listen to. It's close to impossible to predict what the hell's going to happen in this conference in a given season. Not like the AAC. Every single game's a question mark. So we'll do what we
Yeah.
can and we'll give you the information we have. But man, it is just,
And we'll have
and
fun
that's
with it.
fun in a
That's
way.
that's
But yeah,
that's the thing. Is like that's really gonna be the goal of the offseason, I think. And that's why at a certain point, like every offseason ends up being kind of fun just because you can kind of in some cases you delude yourself into thinking your team's gonna be better than they are or they're gonna be. But there's something fun about that. And it's like, yeah, I mean, we'll look back and be like, wow, I can't believe I ever thought that. But it was the middle of the offseason, there was nothing else to talk about, and it was
yep.
fun. So that's what we'll keep
We're
doing.
gonna have some fun times, especially by
Yeah.
July when we've just both lost our minds that there's not football and are going crazy.
Yeah, we'll have NCAA to play, so we'll just do some live streams of
Hell
NCAA
yeah,
on the
we will.
podcast.
Oh God, yeah, let's not, please.
All right, we'll move into the football news. We'll leave the conversation there. Couple of recruiting wins that we need to mention. 2025 Palm Beach Central four-star. He's a DB listed as an athlete too. Tony Williams, he committed to UCF, and they also got a commitment from 2025 cornerback from Cedartown, which is in Georgia, DeMarcus Gardner. Believe on 247 he was like unranked. I think on three has him as a 3-star right now, and I don't know if it's just early in the process for him to get rated or what, but two
Yeah, I
new
think
two new commitments for
I think
UCF.
UCF kind of use him as a gem type guy, someone that they're in on that they think more teams should be than are.
Yeah. And then a couple other things. UCF sending a big delegation to the Big 12 Pro Days, which is in a couple weeks, or that next week, I think, actually. It is Zach Marsh, Wojan, Jawan Forte, Corey Gamage, Bula Schmidt, Tremont Morris Brash. I'm hoping Tremont does something crazy that like
I
puts him on
know.
people's radars. John Rice Plumley, Javon Baker, Alec Holler to Jordan Mask, to Corian Patterson, Mark Anthony Richards, Walter Yates, Jordan Johnson, Tyler Grable, Jairo Wilson, Lukahi Paule, and Sean Peterson. I don't know how many times I'm going to say it is like I think it's so cool, and I can't believe no conference ever thought to do a conference-wide pro day before.
Yeah, that's
And
one of your Mark's like huge things that I can't believe no one ever
yeah,
thought about that.
I'm really intrigued to see how this plays out and how much attention that gets because it should be a lot. I would think it's going to be a lot. But last piece of news: the Seahawks are bringing in John Rice Plumlee. They're bringing him in on one of their top 30 visits, which was a surprise to see come across my phone today. But yeah, it's pretty cool for John Rice. So that's nice. We will move into game of the week. It's a shame after what was kind of a fun basketball season that there will be no NIT for UCF. It's a shame that the
Didn't play an
season
NIT
ended.
game. Yeah, didn't happen.
No, shame that the season ended with that conference tournament loss to BYU. You know, was
I hope
hoping we'd
there's
see some
someone
more
who
of
listens
them.
to this podcast who like really doesn't follow the basketball team and is just like, oh, I didn't know they didn't make it. That's too bad.
Yeah, they didn't make it. Which kind of sucks, but oh well. We're on to tunnel vision on UCF baseball and UCF softball. This week's game of the weeks, though, game of the weeks. 3 games. Obviously, we always do the series for softball and baseball, but UCF softball hosting number 2 Texas this weekend. Softball 14-11, 2-4 in the Big 12. They just got swept at number 4 Oklahoma State, and it doesn't get any easier because they come back home and host number 2. Texas is 24-3 and 5-1 in the Big 12. They play Friday at 6, Saturday at 2, and Sunday at 12. And this is one of those series where like I don't tough ask to say, hey, win the series, win at least a game.
Yeah.
You kind of need that for your resume. Cause like
You can't just keep getting swept, you know?
and yeah, because like in the Big 12, and this is the way for basketball, this is the way for probably baseball and softball. It's like you're not always gonna have like the gaudy records, But if you have you need to have a good enough record and have some of these wins on your resume to say like, okay, they were right around. I don't know. It'll depend on the year, but like a little bit above 500, I think will do it most years. But right now they're 2-4 after getting swept. Like the more you get swept, you're just falling further and
Yeah.
further in a hole, and you're not going to be able to climb out of it. So hopefully they win at least a game. If they won the series, obviously it would be huge. You'd kind of start feeling immediately different about the season ahead, and that's the kind of the curse of this conference is like on a given weekend you can have a really big result in any sport and think like, wow, like that's huge. Come out the next weekend, play another good team, and lose, and all of a sudden you're back to square one. So we'll see. We'll see what softball does this coming weekend against Texas. But with all that, tweet of the week.
Tweet of the week. So unfortunately for tweet of the week, we're going to have to drop the lie that UCF did not make the NIT. They in fact did make the NIT.
I'm just going to take my headphones out.
That's fine.
I'm going to maintain my lie.
We'll talk to you later, Bailey. We'll see you next week. And they lost to USF, which if you're a UCF fan of any kind, was quite an unbearable thing to occur and has me and others quite upset. I'm not in a good mood. It was genuinely awful. But I would like to shout out what I genuinely think in all the times of doing all the tweet of the weeks that we've done on this podcast might be one of the worst. And that would be from the Barstool UCF account out UCF Stool on Twitter, an account I generally do enjoy a lot. Very good account. Not so much with this tweet. I also have to say that, you know, it's not that this is one of those accounts that I like a lot until a game's on and then it gets a little insane. But anyway, after UCF lost this game, the Barstool UCF account tweeted, this is somehow real. I'm so serious. Where do we go from here? Because this feels like rock bottom. So I just want to let's break this down. So UCF basketball unanimously across all of the known universe picks to finish last in the Big 12 this year, believed by everyone to basically just be a joke of a team in this conference. Easiest pick in the world. UCF fans are talking like they're going to go 5-25. They go into the Big 12. They beat number 3 Kansas. They beat top 25 Oklahoma. They beat top 25 Texas Tech. AdFi emerges as one of the most fun environments in the Big 12. They go to the Big 12 tournament. They win a game in the Big 12 tournament. They finished the year with a winning record in the toughest basketball conference in America, the SEC of college basketball, by a lot. It's even more dominant basketball than the SEC is in football. And they not just competed in the first year, they competed almost every game. Everyone talks about what a fun season it was. They even, on top of that, have 3 blue chip prospects likely coming in for next season, which is so far away from any kind of talent this program's ever had. And that's before they even get into the portal. Jalen Sellers, he's announced he's back. This is rock bottom because they lost a goddamn NIT game. Listen, I don't like losing to USF. It is one of the worst things in the world. I'm not happy they lost the game. I'm actually really pissed they lost the game. But, oh my God, to call this rock bottom is genuinely one of the dumbest things I have ever seen on social media. And just, I'm so sick, and I'm going to try to not do the rant I've done about 50 billion times in this podcast, but it's become a larger than Johnny Dawkins thing to me. I'm so sick of the growing chunk of this fan base that just no longer exists in reality and just exists in this weird sort of world where nothing makes sense. And anytime anything isn't perfect for UCF, their plan is to literally nuke the administration and start from scratch. It's really wearing on me. It's wearing on me, like even really wanting to be a part of this fan base because it's just so frustrating. And I say that like I'm ever going to freaking leave. I still love it because I'm insane and I'm going to be here no matter what.
Could never picture you walking away from this.
To even say it as a joke. Like I'm never going anywhere. And I love you guys. And I want to be clear. I want to be clear that if you're someone listening to this and you want Dawkins gone, I'm not like, well, you know, you want Dawkins gone, so get out of here. There's a difference between wanting a coach gone or not wanting a coach gone and declaring this moment in time rock bottom of a program. I genuinely am so baffled by that tweet, and I'm so baffled by the people who liked it and retweeted it and agreed with it. I need you guys to have an ounce of common sense. I really do, because I'm so sick of this chunk of the fan base, and I'm so sick of that. They not only feel this way, but kind of attack anyone who doesn't feel that the administration needs to be nuked anytime anything happens. Which in some ways, this is actually the most on-brand for college athletics thing I've ever seen, is that you lose to your rivals, so you want your program destroyed. I in some ways it tracks, but just remarkable tweeting. I really can't believe it.
I think part of it is so common sense. You mentioned common sense. Common sense goes out the window when emotions get involved sometimes. It's true. And that's what it is.
This was tweeted very quickly after the game ended, but you know,
emotion. I do this all the time. I tweet emotionally, and I know a lot of people in this fan base tweet emotionally, and they don't make a lot of sense. Usually I like to think that I make sense even when I'm emotional, but sometimes I don't, and I'll admit that. But yeah, no, that's just a And that's a wild thing to say.
What would you even think if I'd told you before this basketball season, when everyone's expecting them to finish last, if I came to you and said, hey, UCF didn't finish last. They had a winning record. They went to the NIT. They just lost the NIT first round game. And there is a very prominent fan account on Twitter declaring this rock bottom of the program. What would you even think happened? You'd think some scandal had happened or like something crazy.
I was gonna say, like, if you hadn't told me all of that, if you had just told me that this tweet would pop up on March 19th, and you told me that at the beginning of the season, I'd be like, oh man, they really did go 2-28.
Yeah.
That sucks. Like they really did. They did only win 2 games. But no, that wasn't the case.
No, they did not. They had a winning record, and it was a very entertaining year where they beat 3 top 25 teams, including in their first ever Big 12 home game, beating Kansas, one of the great brands of the sport. Rock bottom, Bailey. This is what it feels like.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to, and I don't know if this is actually the case because we'll see what happens with Johnny Dawkins and all that and the fallout of this. If he leaves, if he gets fired, if he gets an extension, and the narratives and whatever talk comes around that. But that aside, I'm looking forward to kind of taking a step back and people just kind of not tweeting about that UCF basketball anymore.
It's going to be bad because I'm mentally prepared for if Dawkins doesn't return next year. We just did a whole podcast on that last week, and Dawkins said in post-game that he expects to be back next year and feels he has the backing of the administration. I didn't really take anything from that because what is he supposed to say? Yeah, I think they're going to fire me. So we'll see. I'm fine with the gloating that's going to come from the chunk of the fan base that at this point is more concerned with getting him fired than whether the team wins or not. I'm talking to the fans who actually are genuinely upset when UCF basketball does well. UCF basketball has basically become American politics for UCF, right? Because it's really not about reality anymore. It's just about everyone wants to be right and no one's ever going to change their opinion on anything. But anyway, I'm prepared for your victory laps if it happens. What I'm not prepared for is when Mahajer hires like Bob Huggins or someone ridiculous and you're all cheering it like you cheered Joe Girardi because you guys love headlines and not reality. So I'm not so much looking forward to that, but
what I'm also not looking forward to is, as I just said that, if people are going to skip from, they're going to be like, all right, we're done talking about UCF basketball. Let's just now talk about how KJ Jefferson's going to win the Heisman. And then just, there's going to be all those hype. There's just going to be all those hype tweets that are out there that you're just kind of like, all right, like, let's, okay. But
can KJ Jefferson have a Cam Newton season for UCF this year? It's going to be the same thing.
Yeah, it is. So maybe I don't know. Maybe I'm not looking forward to anything UCF Twitter related. But thank you everybody for listening. Appreciate it. Yeah, guys, keep listening. We'll keep having some fun throughout this off season. Coming up on episode 200 and coming up on the spring game here in a couple weeks. So that'll be an exciting time. But yeah, thank you guys everybody for listening. We'll be back next week with episode 198. Be sure you're following us on Twitter at Bailey J Adams 22, at by CA Simmons, at Night Sports Now, and at Pegasus Podcast. Thank you guys so much for being with us, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye, everybody.